The research camp on Meridian of 4 buzzed with frustrated energy as another translation attempt failed. Dr. Rebecca Stone stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately noticed the tension, hanging in the air like smoke. Alien researchers moved between the prefabricated buildings with quick, agitated steps, their voices carrying sharp tones of disagreement in languages she couldn't understand. Rebecca adjusted her field pack and looked toward the massive stone structures that dominated the valley ahead. The ruins stretched for kilometers, their dark surfaces covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the afternoon light. She had seen photographs, but standing here in person made her breath catch. These weren't just ancient buildings. They were monuments to a civilization that had mastered sciences the current galaxy could barely comprehend. "You must be the human linguist," said a voice behind her. Rebecca turned to see a tall, elegant creature with pale blue skin and 6 delicate arms. "I am Professor Quinn of the Altani Academy. I confess I was expecting someone older." Rebecca smiled and extended her hand, a gesture that seemed to puzzle the alien professor. "Dr. Rebecca Stone, University of Chicago. Age doesn't always correlate with ability, Professor." Quinn's 4 eyes blinked in what Rebecca interpreted as skepticism. "Indeed. Well, I suppose we shall see. Dr. Nala will show you to the main research facility. She has been working on the first script longer than anyone here." The walk to the central building took them past dozens of alien researchers hunched over tablets and holographic displays. Rebecca noticed the same pattern everywhere. Symbols from the ruins displayed on screens, followed by error messages and frustrated gestures. Some of the researchers had been here for years, judging by the worn paths between buildings and the permanent housing structures. Dr. Nala turned out to be a compact, furry being with large, intelligent eyes and hands that moved constantly as she spoke. Her species, the Breviks, were known throughout the galaxy for their methodical approach to complex problems. If anyone could crack an ancient language through pure systematic analysis, it would be them. 18 years, Nala said without preamble as they entered the main lab. 18 years I have been staring at these symbols and they make no sense. We have tried every linguistic model, every pattern recognition system, every quantum computer algorithm available to the Council. Nothing works. The lab was impressive. Holographic displays showed 3-dimensional maps of the ruins with detailed scans of every surface. Translation workstations lined the walls, each one displaying different approaches to the same impossible puzzle. Rebecca walked slowly between them, taking in the complexity of the work. "What makes you think this is even a language?" she asked, stopping at one display that showed a particularly dense cluster of symbols. Nala's fur bristled slightly. "Of course it's a language. What else could it be? These symbols appear in consistent patterns throughout the ruins. They clearly convey information. The mathematical models all confirm linguistic structures." Rebecca nodded but didn't respond immediately. She pulled out a small tablet from her pack and began photographing the displays. The symbols were beautiful in their complexity, flowing and geometric at the same time. But something about them nagged at her, a familiarity she couldn't quite place. "Has anyone considered that this might not be a traditional language at all?" she asked after several minutes of study. Professor Quinn, who had been observing from across the room, approached with what Rebecca was learning to recognize as barely contained exasperation. "Dr. Stone, we have the finest linguistic minds in the galaxy working on this problem. We have considered every possibility." "I'm sure you have," Rebecca said diplomatically. "Could you show me the context where these symbols appear most frequently?" Nala led her to a large display showing the interior of one of the larger structures. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with symbols, but they weren't random. They formed clear groupings with certain patterns repeating at regular intervals. Rebecca stared at the display for a long moment, then started laughing. The lab fell silent. Professor Quinn's 4 eyes widened in what was clearly offense. "Dr. Stone, I fail to see what is amusing about our situation." "I'm sorry," Rebecca said, wiping her eyes. "It's just, you said this language was impossible to learn, right?" "Correct," Nala replied stiffly. "No linguistic model has been able to establish consistent meaning." "That's because you're all approaching this as a language," Rebecca said, pulling up her own tablet and scrolling through files. "But look at these groupings. Look at the way certain symbols repeat, the spacing, the hierarchical arrangements." She found what she was looking for and held up her tablet. On the screen was a page from a human elementary mathematics textbook showing basic counting exercises. "You learn this in kindergarten," she said, comparing the tablet to the wall display. "These aren't words. They're numbers." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Quinn's elegant features went through several color changes, while Dr. Nala's large eyes grew even larger. "Numbers?" Nala whispered. "Mathematical notation?" Rebecca confirmed, growing more excited as the pattern became clear. "Look, this grouping here shows progression from simple to complex. One symbol, then two, then three, but not in base 10 like we use. They're using a different base system, maybe base 12 or 16. She moved to another section of the display, and this section shows relationships between the basic symbols. Addition, subtraction, maybe even early algebra concepts. The reason your linguistic models failed is because this isn't grammar. It's mathematics expressed as visual language." Professor Quinn sank into a nearby chair, his 6 arms folding in what Rebecca suspected was deep thought. "But that's impossible. No civilization structures mathematical concepts this way." "We do," Rebecca said simply. "Human children learn number systems exactly like this. We start with basic counting, then move to place values, then to operations between numbers. The progression is almost identical." Dr. Nala was already at her workstation pulling up new analysis programs. "If you're correct, this changes everything. These aren't religious texts or historical records. They're instruction manuals," Rebecca finished. "Technical specifications written in pure mathematics. And if I'm right about the base system they're using, I can start translating them within a few hours." The lab erupted in activity as researchers abandoned their linguistic approaches and began examining the symbols through mathematical models. Professor Quinn stood slowly, his expression mixing wonder with something that might have been embarrassment. "Dr. Stone," he said formally, "it appears we may have underestimated both the problem and your species' ability to solve it." Rebecca was already lost in the work. Her tablet connected to the lab's computers as she began mapping number progressions. "Professor," she said without looking up, "you haven't seen anything yet." 3 days later, Rebecca sat surrounded by a collection of items that made the alien researchers shake their heads in bewilderment. Children's counting blocks lay scattered across her desk next to advanced holographic displays showing the first script. A simple abacus sat next to quantum computational, arrays worth more than most planetary budgets. Educational songs about numbers played softly from her tablet, while she worked through translation matrices that had stumped the galaxy's best minds for decades. Dr. Nala approached cautiously, as if the human materials might be contaminated with some kind of intellectual regression virus. "Dr. Stone, I must ask again, are you certain these toys are relevant to our work?" Rebecca looked up from where she was arranging colored blocks in patterns that matched the ancient symbols. "Dr. Nala, how did your species first learn mathematical concepts?" The brevet scientist's fur twitched in thought. "Through formal academic instruction, of course. Advanced computational theories introduced at the adolescent stage of development, when the mind is capable of abstract reasoning. And before that? Before that, mathematical concepts would be incomprehensible. Brevet children focus on practical skills, tool use, social cooperation, basic communication." Rebecca nodded and picked up a simple wooden block marked with the number 3. "Humans start teaching math the day a child can hold objects. We count fingers and toes. We sing songs about numbers. We play games where mathematical relationships become second nature, before the child even knows what mathematics is." She arranged several blocks in a pattern that exactly matched a symbol sequence from the ruins. "Look at this progression. In human education, we call this skip counting. Children learn it as a game, but it's actually the foundation for understanding multiplication, division, and eventually advanced algebra." Professor Quinn had been observing from across the room, his skepticism evident in the way his 4 eyes kept narrowing at the sight of the children's materials. "Dr. Stone, these ancient beings created technology that surpasses our most advanced systems. Surely they didn't learn their mathematics through games." "Why not?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. "Professor, what if the sophistication of their technology came from the fact that they never lost the intuitive understanding of mathematical relationships that children naturally possess?" She pulled up a holographic display showing one of the more complex symbol arrangements from the ruins. "Watch this." she said, then began building the same pattern using her collection of blocks and simple counting tools. The process was methodical but playful, like a child building an elaborate tower. As the physical model took shape, the meaning of the ancient symbols suddenly became clear. Dr. Nala's large eyes widened as she recognized what she was seeing. That's a formula for energy distribution across multiple dimensional spaces, she whispered, built using the same cognitive processes that human 5-year-olds used to learn that 2 + 2 = 4, Rebecca confirmed. The complexity is in the application, not the fundamental thinking. She moved to another section of symbols that had particularly puzzled the research team. Look at this sequence. Your computers identified it as linguistically impossible because it seemed to violate every rule about how information should be structured. Rebecca began singing softly under her breath, a simple children's song about counting by twos. As she sang, she pointed to each symbol in sequence and the pattern became obvious. The impossible structure was actually a mnemonic device, designed to help people remember complex mathematical relationships through rhythm and repetition. It's a teaching song, Professor Quinn said, his voice filled with wonder. They embedded advanced engineering specifications in educational music. Exactly, Rebecca said, her excitement growing. And once you understand that, everything else starts falling into place. Over the next several hours, Rebecca demonstrated how each impossible aspect of the first script corresponded to techniques used in human early childhood education. Complex spatial relationships became simple counting games. Advanced theoretical mathematics transformed into finger play songs. Quantum mechanical principles were expressed through pattern-matching exercises that any human kindergartner would recognize. Dr. Nala worked frantically at her computational array, feeding Rebecca's insights into the translation algorithms. For the first time in 18 years, the symbols began yielding coherent meaning. Technical specifications emerged from what had previously been incomprehensible scratches on ancient walls. Dr. Stone, Nala said, her voice tight with excitement. These aren't just mathematical formulas. They're blueprints, construction plans for technologies I don't even have names for. Rebecca nodded, barely looking up from her work. She had moved beyond simple symbol recognition to actual reading, scanning the ancient text with increasing fluency. Faster than light communication arrays, she murmured, translating as she read. Dimensional energy taps. Gravity manipulation systems. Professor Quinn approached slowly as if afraid to disturb the process. How is this possible? How can a language based on children's games describe technologies we've never even imagined? Rebecca paused in her reading and looked up at him. Professor, what's the most sophisticated computer in the galaxy? The Quantum Nexus Array on Centauri Prime, he answered immediately. It can process more information in 1 second than most species generate in a lifetime. And how does it work, fundamentally? Professor Quinn's expression grew thoughtful. Binary processing. 1s and 0s in various combinations. The same 1s and 0s that human children learn when they're taught to count in base 2, Rebecca said gently. Complexity doesn't come from making the basics more complicated. It comes from combining simple concepts in sophisticated ways. She gestured to the displays around them, now showing translated passages of breathtaking technical detail. These people understood that. They built their most advanced technologies on the same mathematical foundations that we teach to children. The difference is that they never forgot how to think like children, with curiosity, creativity, and an intuitive understanding of how patterns work. Dr. Nala looked up from her computations, her expression mixing excitement with something that might have been fear. Dr. Stone, if these translations are accurate, this technology could change everything. Faster than light travel, unlimited energy, communication across galactic distances in real time. Yes, Rebecca said quietly, already turning back to the next section of text. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Professor Quinn settled into a chair near her workspace, his skepticism replaced by fascination. What does the next section say? Rebecca smiled, picking up a simple toy that helped children learn about shapes and relationships. Well, if I'm reading this correctly, it's instructions for building a machine that can fold space like origami. They explain it using the same techniques we use to teach kids about geometric transformations. She began arranging the toy pieces according to the ancient patterns. Want to learn how to bend reality? First, let me teach you a children's game about squares and triangles. The research lab fell silent except for the soft sound of Rebecca's voice explaining advanced physics, through nursery rhymes and the gentle clicking of children's toys being arranged according to patterns that were older than galactic civilization itself. 2 weeks into the translation project, an uncomfortable silence had settled over the research station. Rebecca continued her work with growing fluency, reading ancient texts as easily as she might read a newspaper. But the implications of her success were creating ripples of unease throughout the galactic community. Dr. Nala stood before a holographic display showing the latest archaeological findings, her usually calm demeanor replaced by visible agitation. "The cranial scans are conclusive," she announced to the assembled research team. "The skull fragments we've recovered show brain structure remarkably similar to human anatomy." Professor Quinn's elegant features had taken on a grayish pallor that Rebecca was learning indicated deep distress in his species. "How similar?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be disturbing. 93% structural correlation, Dr. Nala replied, particularly in the regions responsible for pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and mathematical processing. The neural pathways that allow humans to intuitively understand numerical relationships appear to be nearly identical to those of the first script civilization. Rebecca looked up from her translation work, where she had been converting a passage about dimensional engineering into equations that several research teams could actually understand. "That explains why the mathematical approaches feel so natural," she said. "We're literally thinking the same way they did." The statement landed in the room like a small explosion. Commander Voss of the Altani delegation, who had arrived that morning with a team of military advisors, spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that humans are somehow descended from this ancient civilization?" "Not necessarily descended," Rebecca replied carefully, "but possibly related through parallel evolution, or—" She hesitated, knowing that what she was about to say would be even more disturbing to the assembled aliens. "Or what?" Professor Quinn demanded. "Or humans might be the closest thing to what the first script people actually were," Rebecca finished. "Maybe the reason no one else could read their language is because no one else thinks like they did." The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Nala pulling up another display. "There's something else," she said quietly. "The star maps Rebecca has translated, they don't just show the location of the civilization's home world. The holographic display filled with points of light, representing star systems throughout the galaxy. As the data loaded, dozens of markers appeared, far more than anyone had expected. 47 systems, Dr. Nala continued. 47 locations where the first script people left similar installations. If the technology at each site is comparable to what we've found here," Commander Voss was already activating his communication array. "I need to contact the hegemony immediately. This changes the strategic balance of the entire galaxy." Rebecca returned to her work, trying to ignore the growing tension around her. The passage she was currently translating dealt with energy production methods that could make current fusion technology look like rubbing sticks together. But as she worked through the technical specifications, another section caught her attention, one that made her stomach clench with worry. "Professor Quinn," she called out, her voice carrying an edge of concern. "Could you look at this section? I think it might be important." The Altani scholar approached, his movements betraying his reluctance to hear more unsettling news. "What have you found now?" Rebecca pointed to a series of symbols that had been carved deeper than the others, as if the ancient writers had wanted to emphasize their importance. "It's a warning," she said, "about what happens when civilizations gain access to this level of technology without the wisdom to use it properly." She began reading aloud, translating as she went. "They write about previous cycles, other civilizations that found their installations and tried to use the technology for military advantage. None of those civilizations survived." Commander Voss stopped his communication and turned toward them. "Define didn't survive." "Complete annihilation," Rebecca replied grimly. "The technology is too powerful for species that think in terms of conquest and domination. It requires a collaborative mindset, the kind of thinking that—" She gestured to her collection of children's educational materials. "The kind of thinking that treats learning as play and sees complex problems as puzzles to solve together, not advantages to hoard." Dr. Nala's fur was standing on end. Are you saying this technology is designed to destroy civilizations that misuse it? I'm saying it's designed to be used by civilizations that think the way its creators did, Rebecca corrected. Civilizations that maintain the cooperative, curious mindset that humans associate with childhood learning. Species that compete for resources and military advantage. The technology simply doesn't work for them. She pulled up another section of text. Look at this. They describe it as a cognitive key. The technology only functions when operated by minds that approach problems with what they call first learning wisdom, the open, collaborative thinking patterns that children use when they're discovering how the world works. Professor Quinn sank into a chair, his 6 arms folding in a gesture of defeat. So human children can operate technology that our greatest minds cannot even comprehend. Not just operate, Rebecca said softly. Improve. The first script people designed their technology to be enhanced and expanded by each generation of users. They expected their inheritors to be even more creative and innovative than they were. Commander Voss was pacing now, his military bearing unable to hide his agitation. This is unacceptable. The balance of galactic power cannot rest on the cognitive patterns of one species' children. Maybe that's exactly the point, Rebecca said, looking up from her translation work. Maybe they designed it that way on purpose. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the ruins. Think about it. For 47 star systems worth of technology to remain unused for millions of years, waiting for someone who thinks the right way, that's not an accident. That's a test. Dr. Nala joined her at the window. A test for what? For whether we're ready, Rebecca replied. Whether we can work together instead of fighting over advantages. Whether we can maintain the wonder and cooperation of childhood while developing adult wisdom. She turned back to face the room. The first script people didn't disappear because they were conquered or because their technology failed. They left because they were waiting for their successors to be ready for what they had created. Commander Voss stopped pacing. And you believe humans are ready? Rebecca shook her head. I don't know if anyone is ready, but I know that trying to take this technology by force or using it for military advantage is exactly what destroyed the last 47 civilizations that found it. She returned to her desk and picked up a simple wooden block painted with the number 1. The question isn't whether humans are special. The question is whether we can all learn to think like children again, curious, cooperative, and more interested in discovering how things work than in controlling who gets to use them. Professor Quinn looked around the room at the various species represented in the research team. And if we cannot? Rebecca began arranging her blocks according to another ancient pattern, one that would teach the assembled aliens about energy distribution across multiple dimensions. Then we'll join the other 47, civilizations that tried to solve complex problems with simple thinking instead of solving simple problems with complex wisdom. The room fell silent as she began building structures that could reshape reality itself, using toys that any human 5-year-old would recognize. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened under circumstances that no one had anticipated when the governing body was first established 3 centuries earlier. Representatives from 43 species gathered in the Great Chamber on Nexus Station, their various forms of agitation creating a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic vibrations that the translation system struggled to process. Admiral Tara of the Brevet Collective stood at the central podium, her compact form radiating the methodical intensity her species was known for. Behind her, holographic displays showed the translated technical specifications that Rebecca had been producing at an alarming rate over the past month. Esteemed representatives, Admiral Tara began, her voice cutting through the noise. We face a situation that requires immediate action. The human translator has now decoded 40% of the primary installation's database. Each day brings revelations that fundamentally alter our understanding of technological possibility. She gestured to the displays, which showed schematics for devices that seemed to violate basic principles of physics, instantaneous communication across galactic distances, energy extraction from dimensional boundaries, matter reorganization at the quantum level. These capabilities could transform any civilization that possesses them. Delegate Cora of the Nexari Collective raised a crystalline appendage. Admiral, our primary concern is not the technology itself, but the implications of its concentration in human hands. No single species has ever possessed such overwhelming technological advantage. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, translated into the various sonic ranges that different species used for communication. The underlying tension was obvious. Fear masked as diplomatic concern. Commander Voss, representing the Altani hegemony, activated his speaking platform. "The situation is more complex than mere technological advantage," he announced. "Our intelligence reports indicate that the humans are expanding their translation efforts. 3 additional linguists arrived at Meridian Life 4 yesterday, and they are establishing training protocols for human graduate students." The chamber erupted in concerned chatter. Delegate Finn of the Outer Rim Confederation spoke above the noise. "Are you suggesting they intend to monopolize this knowledge?" "I am suggesting they intend to become indispensable," Commander Voss replied grimly. "Within months, humanity could possess the only individuals capable of accessing the most advanced technology in galactic history." Back on Meridian 4, Rebecca was completely absorbed in her work, unaware of the political storm brewing around her discoveries. Dr. Paul Grant, her colleague from Earth, had arrived with a team of graduate students who showed an almost disturbing aptitude for learning the first script. Within days, they were reading technical specifications that had mystified alien scholars for decades. "It's like learning to read all over again," said Lisa, one of the graduate students, as she worked through a passage about gravitational manipulation. "Once you understand that it's all just mathematical relationships, the symbols become as clear as regular text." Rebecca nodded absently. Her attention focused on a particularly complex section that seemed to describe transportation methods. "Paul, look at this sequence. I think they're explaining how to fold space for instantaneous travel between distant points." Dr. Grant studied the symbols over her shoulder. "The energy requirements would be enormous. How do they propose to generate that much power?" "With this," Rebecca said, pointing to an earlier section of the text. "They describe harvesting energy directly from the dimensional barriers between realities. It's like tapping into the fundamental structure of space-time itself." Professor Quinn, who had been observing the human researchers with growing unease, approached their workstation. "Dr. Stone, I must ask, are you planning to share these translation methods with other species?" Rebecca looked up, surprised by the question. "Of course. Why wouldn't we?" "Because," Professor Quinn said carefully, "there are those in the galactic community who believe humans intend to use this knowledge for their own advancement." "That's ridiculous," Dr. Grant interjected. "Scientific knowledge belongs to everyone. We're already preparing educational materials that could help other species learn the translation techniques." But even as he spoke, alerts began flashing on the communication arrays throughout the research station. Dr. Nala rushed to the main console, her expression growing increasingly alarmed as she processed the incoming messages. "We have a problem," she announced. "Multiple council fleets are moving toward this system. Official reason is protection of galactic interests, but the deployment pattern suggests something else entirely." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. "What kind of deployment patterns?" "Blockade formations," Dr. Nala replied grimly. "Someone intends to control access to this installation." The next few hours brought a series of increasingly urgent communications from various galactic powers. The Altani hegemony demanded that all humans be removed from the translation project and replaced with neutral researchers. The Brevik Collective insisted on joint oversight of all discoveries. Several smaller systems had formed an ad hoc alliance specifically to prevent any single species from gaining access to first script technology. Through it all, Rebecca continued working, driven by a growing sense that time was running out. The ancient text she was translating painted an increasingly clear picture of what had happened to previous civilizations that had found these installations. The pattern was always the same: initial cooperation giving way to competition, competition escalating to conflict, and conflict ending in destruction so complete that even the ruins were scattered across space. "Professor Quinn," she called out as she finished translating another warning passage, "you need to see this." The Altani scholar approached reluctantly, as if afraid of what new revelation awaited him. "They write about something called the cooperation imperative," Rebecca explained. "The technology requires multiple operators working in perfect synchronization. Not just technical synchronization, cognitive synchronization. The operators have to think alike, trust each other completely, and work toward common goals. Professor Quinn's four eyes widened as he grasped the implication. Species that compete or distrust each other cannot operate the technology at all. Worse than that, Rebecca continued. According to this, attempts to force cooperation or use the technology for competitive advantage triggers what they call cascade failure. The installations don't just shut down. They actively dismantle themselves and everything within a significant radius. She pointed to a section covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with warning. They describe it as protection against wisdom-blind civilizations, societies that gain access to power beyond their ethical development. Dr. Grant looked up from his own translation work. Rebecca, this section describes the 47 previous civilizations that found installations like this one. Every single one tried to use the technology for military or economic advantage. And every single one was completely annihilated when the installations detected misuse, Rebecca finished. Not by the technology being used as a weapon, but by the technology recognizing that it was in the hands of people who weren't ready for it. The communication array chimed with another incoming message. This one flagged as highest priority. Dr. Nala activated the display, and the holographic form of Admiral Terra appeared. Dr. Stone, the Admiral said without preamble, you and your team are to cease all translation activities immediately. Galactic Council forces are en route to secure the installation and establish proper oversight protocols. Rebecca looked at the translation still waiting on her desk. Then at the warnings she had just discovered about what happened to civilizations that tried to control this technology through force. Admiral, she said quietly, with respect, I think you should read what happened to the last group that tried that approach. The hologram flickered as Admiral Terra processed this response. Dr. Stone, this is not a negotiation. Compliance is mandatory. Rebecca turned back to her translation work, her hands already moving to continue decoding the ancient warnings. Admiral, compliance might get us all killed. The communication ended abruptly, leaving the research station in tense silence. Outside, the first of the Council fleets began appearing at the edge of the star system, their weapons arrays powering up as they moved into blockade positions. The test that the first script civilization had designed was about to begin in earnest. The massive stone door had been sealed for millions of years, but Rebecca's translations had finally revealed the sequence needed to open it. As the ancient mechanisms hummed to life, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Dr. Paul Grant stood beside her, holding a tablet containing the most recent communications from Earth. The President wants to know if we should evacuate, he said quietly. 17 different fleet groups are now positioned around this system, and none of them are talking to each other. Rebecca studied the symbols carved around the doorway as it slowly ground open. Paul, look at this inscription. It's not just decoration. It's another warning. She ran her fingers over the ancient marks, translating as she read. Here lies the final test for those who would inherit the stars. Enter only if you seek wisdom over power, knowledge over advantage, cooperation over dominance. Ominous, Dr. Grant muttered. Should we be worried about the final test part? Before Rebecca could answer, the door finished opening, revealing a chamber that defied every expectation. The space was enormous, stretching beyond the reach of their lights, but what filled it was far more significant than its size. The walls were covered in continuous text, millions of symbols flowing in elegant spirals from floor to ceiling. It's a complete record, Rebecca whispered in amazement. The entire history of their civilization, and everything they learned about the civilizations that came before them. Dr. Nala and Professor Quinn entered behind them, their faces reflecting the same awe that Rebecca felt. But as they moved deeper into the chamber, their wonder turned to growing alarm. Rebecca, Dr. Nala said, her voice tight with concern, these symbols here, they're describing events that haven't happened yet. Rebecca moved to where the Brevik scientist was standing and began reading the passage she indicated. Her blood grew cold as the meaning became clear. They're not predictions, she said slowly. They're patterns. Behavioral patterns that repeat across civilizations that find these installations. She continued reading, her voice growing quieter with each translated line. First comes the discovery, made by minds that think like children. Then comes the recognition of power beyond imagining. Then comes the fear, the competition, the demand for control. Professor Quinn was reading another section, his elegant features growing pale. Dr. Stone, this describes military fleets surrounding installation sites. It describes civilizations dividing into factions, each convinced that the others cannot be trusted with such power. And then? Dr. Grant asked, though his expression suggested he didn't want to know the answer. Rebecca found the next section of the pattern and felt her heart sink. Then comes the violence. Someone always decides that force is the only way to ensure the technology doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Someone always convinces themselves that they're acting to protect the galaxy. She moved further along the wall, following the flow of text. And when the violence begins, the installations respond. Not as weapons, but as judges. They evaluate whether the species finding them has the wisdom to use them responsibly. And if they don't? Professor Quinn asked. Rebecca reached the final section of the pattern and stopped reading aloud. The symbols described the end result with clinical precision. Complete civilizational collapse. Populations reduced to pre-technological levels. Spacefaring capability eliminated for millennia. Not through attack, but through the systematic failure of every advanced technology the civilizations possessed. The installations don't destroy civilizations directly, she said finally. They remove the technological foundations that the civilizations depend on. Everything from faster-than-light travel to basic computing systems simply stops working. Dr. Nala's fur was standing completely on end. They're designed to cause technological regression? They're designed to prevent immature civilizations from destroying themselves and others with power they're not ready for, Rebecca corrected. The technology only continues to function for species that prove they can cooperate instead of compete for advantage. An alarm began sounding throughout the research station, and Dr. Grant's communication array buzzed with urgent messages. The fleets are moving, he reported grimly. Intelligence suggests someone's about to try taking the installation by force. Rebecca was already moving deeper into the chamber, following the spiral text toward what appeared to be a central platform. There's more here. Instructions for what they call the Wisdom Protocol. The others followed her as she climbed the ancient steps to a raised platform in the center of the chamber. At its heart was a complex array of crystalline structures that pulsed with soft light. It's a control interface, she realized. But not for the technology we've been translating. This controls the installations themselves. She began reading the instructions carved into the platform, her translation becoming increasingly urgent. Paul, they're giving us a choice. We can activate the Wisdom Protocol manually, which evaluates whether galactic civilization is ready for first script technology, or we can wait for the automatic evaluation, which triggers when violence begins at installation sites. What's the difference? Professor Quinn asked. Manual activation allows for education and gradual development, Rebecca replied. Automatic activation. She paused, reading the warnings that surrounded the control interface. Automatic activation assumes the civilization has failed the test and initiates immediate technological regression. Dr. Grant was monitoring the communications from the fleet surrounding the system. Rebecca, I'm seeing weapon systems powering up. Someone's about to make a very bad decision. She looked at the control interface, then at the warnings covering every surface around them. The first script civilization had faced this exact situation before, watching as species after species failed the same test in the same way. There's something else, she said, finding another section of text, instructions for what they call cooperative integration. If multiple species can work together to activate the Wisdom Protocol, demonstrating actual collaboration instead of competition, the technology remains available to all of them, Professor Quinn finished, reading over her shoulder. But only as long as they continue to cooperate. An explosion in the distance shook the installation, followed by another alarm. Dr. Nala was monitoring the external sensors, and her expression was grim. Combat has begun. 3 different factions are engaging each other in orbit, while trying to send armed teams to the surface. Rebecca placed her hands on the control interface, feeling the ancient crystals respond to her touch. The symbols around them began glowing brighter, and she could sense vast systems throughout the galaxy, beginning to evaluate the current galactic civilization. The automatic protocol is starting, she said urgently. We have maybe minutes before it decides we've failed the test. She turned to face the others. But the manual protocol requires representatives from at least 5 different species working together to activate it. 5 species who trust each other enough to link their minds temporarily with the system. Professor Quinn stepped forward without hesitation. The Altani will participate. Dr. Nala was already moving toward the interface. The Breviks as well. But they needed more representatives, and outside, the violence was escalating as different factions fought for control of what they saw as the ultimate prize. Rebecca began entering the preliminary commands for manual activation, knowing that they were racing against both time and the fundamental nature of galactic civilization itself. The ancient test was beginning, and everything would depend on whether the galaxy's species could learn to think like children playing a cooperative game, instead of adults fighting over resources. The crystals pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the vast network of installations across 47 star systems, ancient judges began their final evaluation of whether the current galactic civilization deserved to inherit the stars. The choice came down to seconds rather than hours. Rebecca stood at the ancient control interface while explosions lit up the sky above Meridian 4, her hands hovering over crystals that would determine the fate of galactic civilization. Around her, representatives from different species waited for her decision. But the mathematics of cooperation was proving more complex than any equation in the first script archives. Dr. Grant monitored the communications array as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. "It's spreading," he announced grimly. "Fighting has broken out at 12 other installation sites. Everyone's trying to secure the technology before their rivals can claim it." Professor Quinn's elegant features showed deep distress as he processed updates from the Altani fleet. "My people are demanding that I secure human cooperation for exclusive access to the translations. They're threatening to classify this as an act of war against the hegemony." Dr. Nyla's fur stood on end as similar messages reached her from Brevik Command. "The collective has issued an ultimatum. Either we establish joint control with humanity, or they will consider the installations a threat to galactic security." Rebecca continued reading the ancient instructions while around her. The same pattern played out that had destroyed 46 civilizations before them. Fear leading to competition, competition leading to threats, threats leading to violence, and violence leading to the complete collapse of technological civilization. "There's another option," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos of competing communications, something the previous civilizations never tried. She gestured to a section of text that spiraled around the base of the control platform. The first script people describe what they call the open path. Instead of trying to control who gets access to the technology, you give the access freely to everyone. Professor Quinn's four eyes widened in alarm. "That's impossible. Some species would use such power irresponsibly. Would they?" Rebecca asked, her hands moving over the control interface as she navigated through ancient menus. "Look at what I'm doing right now. I'm accessing the most powerful technology in galactic history, and I'm using it to try to save everyone instead of giving my own species an advantage." She pulled up a holographic display, showing the status of all 47 installations across the galaxy. The Wisdom Protocol doesn't just evaluate individual civilizations. It evaluates the choice between cooperation and competition when the stakes are highest. Dr. Grant was reading over her shoulder as she worked through the translation of the open path instructions. "Rebecca, this is describing how to release all the first script knowledge simultaneously to every species in the galaxy. Complete technological specifications, construction blueprints, operational manuals, everything." "Exactly," Rebecca said, her fingers dancing over controls that responded to her intentions as much as her touch. "No one gets an advantage because everyone gets everything. The technology is too complex for any single species to monopolize. Anyway, it requires cooperation between different cognitive approaches to operate safely." Dr. Nala looked up from her own workstation where she had been monitoring the installation's defensive systems. "Dr. Stone, the automatic regression protocol is building toward activation. We have less than 10 minutes before the system decides we've failed the test." Another explosion, closer this time, shook the installation. The various factions fighting in orbit had begun landing troops on the surface, each convinced that they could secure the technology through force. Rebecca made her decision. She activated the open path protocol and began broadcasting every translation she had completed directly to the public networks of every major civilization. Technical specifications for faster-than-light communication, dimensional energy systems, and gravity manipulation began flooding academic institutions, research centers, and universities across the galaxy. The response was immediate and chaotic. Government officials demanded that the transmissions be stopped. Military commanders tried to secure the data for exclusive use, and academic institutions began frantically downloading everything they could access. But something else happened that no one had expected. Children began reading the transmissions. Human children who had learned the first script translation techniques during Rebecca's educational broadcasts started accessing the technical specifications and treating them like elaborate puzzles. Young Breivik mathematicians found that the dimensional energy equations made perfect sense when approached as abstract art, rather than engineering problems. Altani students discovered that the gravity manipulation formulas worked beautifully when sung as educational songs. "Professor Quinn," Rebecca called out, pointing to her monitoring displays. "Look at the access patterns. The most successful translations aren't coming from government research teams or military laboratories." The Altani scholar studied the data with growing amazement. "Schools," he said softly. "Educational institutions. Study groups combining students from different species. Children learning together," Dr. Nala added, her voice filled with wonder. Just like the original first script civilization intended, the fighting in orbit began to lose intensity as the combating factions realized that the technology they were fighting over was already being freely distributed to everyone. More importantly, initial attempts to build weapons using first script technology were failing spectacularly. The system simply wouldn't function when approached with competitive or dominating mindsets, but the collaborative projects were succeeding beyond anyone's imagination. A joint research station established by students from 6 different species successfully activated their first faster-than-light communication array within hours of receiving the blueprints. A children's science fair on Earth demonstrated stable dimensional energy extraction, using equipment built from translated specifications and powered by the kind of enthusiastic cooperation that adults had forgotten how to access. Rebecca stepped back from the control interface as the Wisdom Protocol completed its evaluation. The results were displayed in symbols that she translated for the assembled group. "Conditional approval," she announced. "Galactic civilization is permitted to continue developing with first script technology, but under specific conditions." Professor Quinn leaned forward eagerly. "What conditions?" "The technology only functions when operated by individuals or groups demonstrating collaborative learning behaviors," Rebecca read from the ancient display. "Competitive use, military applications, or attempts at monopolization result in immediate system shutdown." She smiled as she read the final section. "And the technology becomes more sophisticated and powerful, the more different species work together to understand and improve it. It's designed to reward cooperation and punish isolation." Dr. Grant was monitoring communications from across the galaxy, his expression shifting from concern to amazement. "Rebecca, you need to see this. The collaborative projects are already surpassing the original specifications. A group of students from 12 different species just figured out how to use the dimensional energy systems for instantaneous matter transportation. And a children's choir combining human, Breivik and Altani children discovered that the gravity manipulation technology responds to harmonic frequencies," Dr. Nala added. "They're creating localized gravity fields by singing mathematical relationships." Rebecca walked to the window overlooking the ruins of Meridian 4. The explosions had stopped, and the various military fleets were beginning to withdraw as their governments realized that the technology they had been fighting over was already freely available to anyone willing to approach it with the right mindset. "The first script. People were right," she said softly. "The most advanced problems require the simplest solutions. Not simple technology, but simple thinking. The kind of open, curious, collaborative thinking that children use naturally." Professor Quinn joined her at the window. "So what happens now?" Rebecca picked up one of the children's counting blocks from her desk, the same simple tools that had first allowed her to crack the first script code. "Now we learn. All of us together. We teach our children to think like the children they already are, and we remember how to think like children ourselves." She tossed the block gently to Professor Quinn, who caught it with 2 of his 6 hands. "Want to learn how to fold space-time? First, let me teach you how to count to 10. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in a classroom on Earth that had been modified to accommodate students from 17 different species. Human children sat next to young Breiviks, Altani adolescents worked through problems with Nixari crystals, and the sound of mathematical songs filled the air in frequencies that spanned the entire sonic spectrum. On the board behind her, equations for faster-than-light travel were written in colorful chalk, next to finger-painting exercises that taught quantum mechanical principles. The most advanced technology in galactic history was being mastered by children who approached it as naturally as they approached learning to read. Remember, Rebecca told her students as they prepared for their next lesson in dimensional engineering, the most sophisticated questions always have simple answers. You just have to remember how to think like someone who's still curious about everything. A young human girl raised her hand. Teacher Rebecca, why do the other grown-ups make everything so complicated? Rebecca smiled and picked up a simple wooden block marked with the number 1. Because they forgot that the best way to reach the stars is to never stop seeing them through the eyes of someone who thinks anything is possible. Outside the classroom windows, ships using first script technology moved between the stars, carrying children from dozens of species to schools where the most important lesson was remembering that learning should always feel like play.